We're here to talk through this challenging Tapa puzzle from Prasanna. It's one that gave at least one of our test solvers a bit of trouble, particularly it was described as, quote, fiddly, as opposed to logic-y, and that's often a sign for us that there are some general concepts or logical concepts that are harder to spot sometimes, but worth totally discussing in a context like this, because they'll be good tips for future puzzles, certainly. I already put in what are the most basic starting steps in a puzzle like this. Some people notate a different sort of way that this is an either or choice, and it's going to be a critical place to look soon. But where I kind of started with this is recognizing a consistent kind of pattern you'll see from time to time, which are groups of diagonally close to touching cells that have single points between them that form what I'll call choke points, kinds of spots where if the Tapa, for instance, in this lower left corner, say these cells, is to get out of the grid, it's going to pass through this cell, or that cell. Ideally at least two, so it's not stranded in this corner with a single end out, but actually has a connectivity, for instance, into the center as well as into the lower right, or into the center as well as up to the upper right, stuff like this. That, you know, these three cells themselves don't give a lot of routes for the Tapa to pass, and it's pretty clear that the left channels is not an option at all. So really in the lower left, these are the only two ways in and out. It's most likely both are going to be used. We don't know yet which. If this is shaded, we know at least this is used. So at the very least, this connection is pretty certain to happen. Get the lower left into the lower right. This is where we start in this corner because it's pretty obvious. Both we have some shaded cells and the 1, 1, 2 works. There are the same three cell scenario up here. We have these two cells. Notice because of the 3 clue, only one of these at most is shaded, although it's not required that either is shaded because there are some options that would miss them. And the last is this cell, and the connection argument or connectivity argument in this case is about, again, the right column. If a 1, 1 clue is here, it's going to form a necessary wall that you can shade one or the other side, but you can't shade both. Yeah, you actually must shade one or the other side, but you can't shade both. So if you do manage to come from the lower right up this column, you can't use either of these cells because of the 3 clue, your 3 maximum size. Come up here, you can't come over. That there is a disconnect required on these two portions of the grid, because you can't use this cell. So that says that exactly one of these must be used, and also there's a loose end in this upper right corner that it's not the case you get in and out of this region, you only exit this region. There is going to be a single branch, but not a connection point through this. So this Tapa is going to have some connectivity issues, and this is certainly going to be driven by elements at the top. These are pretty easy choke points, I think, relatively to spot. There are some more subtle ones in this puzzle. These are the ones that I actually looked at next, in part because my attention's often to that sort of 4-1 clue that it only has 2 ways it's shaded, but it's pretty intriguing that in one of those ways both of these cells are unused. If you notice that, you can't come out to the right, and I might as well put in the grid, you cannot wrap around these corners. If you can't come this way, you can't come that way. You certainly can't block off both of these cells and get something shaded here anywhere out of the grid that's completely trapped. And so if you see that these two cells form their own kind of choke points for getting into and out of this group of cells here, any cell that's shaded in this space, and certainly at least one cell is shaded in that space, is going to need ways in and out, and that suggests that what you need is to actually shade the ways in and out when you're shading the 1, 1, 1, 1 clue. And the deduction I just showed is sort of trivial. Once you identify those two cells as critical, we can do a little more over here. Some intuition would suggest that the 3 probably uses these two cells so it can get in and out of regions. It looks like this top is going to have connectivity as its main issue, so in a competition I might quickly put that in, but since we're going by logic here, I'll leave it as is with just the dark shaded cells. Competition, I'd actually mark it like this because I know what's sure and what's a guess. If you're thinking about notation, it's useful to separate those out. So what's left to look at? Everything in this puzzle has elements of symmetry to so that these two cells are important suggests these two cells are also important. And why is that? Well, anything that's shaded in this box needs to get out. It can't come down, it can't come around. Same scenario really is over in this side. So it's got to use at least one of these cells to get out. The reason there's at least a cell shaded here is the 1, 1, 2 clue. You can't have all three of these cells not used, so at least one of them must be used. And that means even if it's just this cell that's shaded, there's a way it's getting out of the grid to back to the center of the puzzle or to other corners of the puzzle. When the diagonally touching clues have a largest option of 2, it's rather particularly hard to get by them. There's actually just 2 patterns that work in this kind of scenario. They both have a stretch of 3 cells in a row. Basically grab 2 from this, grab 2 from that with the center piece shared by both, and then rapidly move away. So down and away, down and away. This is over and away. One thing you'll want to notice about that, again with these 2 cells as our focus of attention, is the one that goes vertically actually forces the 3rd cell by this 2 clue to not be used. And that suggests that this one between them may be critical to actually not get shaded, because in most cases you're going to want to connect through the space, get the Tapa all in one piece. And with these cells as highlight, the actual breakthrough I made in the puzzle was to figure out how this 1, 3 is getting connected to the rest of the grid. There's always the challenge of which of these is not used. It seems that there's a lot you can sort of keep in your mind. If you imagine the unused cell is on the left, and it's going to critically start to form a complete isolation of this corner. It looks like it's problematic. These aren't going to get together quickly. For instance, it can't get together through this upper path. So let's just sketch out in our minds what this would look like. You can keep this in your mind, then you can probably solve this whole puzzle logically. The first loop has to come down, use the 3 clue to get out. It gets to this cell. It can't come to the right with a 2 and stay connected, so it's got to come down 1. We just talked about how having the center cell shaded blocks off the rest of the grid, and so if it comes down to this cell, the cell isn't used, it can't come out this way, it can't come out that way, it can't come out this way, it's completely blocked off. And if you can convince yourself this is shaded, now everything we've set up in writing out notes for this puzzle comes to play. This is not used, so this cell is certainly used for connectivity. I'm going to just start saying for connectivity for a lot of steps here. This cell must be used to stay connected. Again, there is a wall. Only one of those 2 cells is shaded. Once that's shaded, we get the rest of the 3. For connectivity, we're not coming to the right. We've got to come down here. Mark that off. For connectivity, these 2 cells get shaded. The 2 part of the clue, which is still not used, uses at least the middle cell. There's no way for it to get out to the top, so it must escape to the bottom. So that's, again, sort of trivial deduction from connectivity. These 2 cells must be shaded, so this part gets to this part of the Tapa. Now we're at a state where there's even a uniqueness trick. Perhaps you want to say if this has a solution, it almost requires this cell to be shaded. Why is that cell shaded? Because that cell's not shaded. There are sort of competition tricks to get around this faster. I'm going to move away from this thinking for the moment, except to recognize that if the bottom is shaded but needs to connect to things, that cell itself must be shaded. That gets us the bottom together with this end, but we still have a group of cells right now just shown by these 3 that this has to connect to. We can make the fact that at least one of these 3 cells is white to say that the only way those get connected is to come through this set of choke points we circled. This cell must be used for connectivity. This cell must be used for connectivity. The middle cannot be used. That was the intuitive argument we had before, but now we've shown it logically. Connectivity suggests that that cell gets shaded, so this group comes together. This cell can't be shaded. There's no 3 in this, so for connectivity we've got to use this cell. These have to come together, so that's the only way. That cancels this. This has to get to the top of the grid still, so it's going to use its 2nd cell there. Come up like this. This now has used its 2 clues, so the 1 isn't there. We get the 3-2 around it. It needs to still grab another cell. That's going to be over here. We now shade this. We finally filled this cell, so the uniqueness argument comes to play. We can fill those two in. We need to keep these connected. So that's going to end up being the 3 clue. And finally, the last cell there. This is a pretty challenging puzzle until you at least break it down into these channels, and particularly these key cells, the ones that we circled during solve certainly, that if you just always keep in mind you're making one top at the end of the day, there are certain kinds of patterns that will almost always fail. And when you have very small clues, this clue for instance, even the 2-2 isn't so large, that wrapping around is going to be challenging. That's the sort of place you want to focus your attention, and that's what set up a way to sort of think of this whole corner as isolated if we didn't actually use that cell in row 2, column 4. Hope you learned something in general about some Tapa puzzles, maybe some notation strategies, and we'll see you again soon.